Hello everyone and welcome to the second panel of the Istanbul Education Summit 2021. Before moving to the panel, I'd like to introduce a video called Curriculum Through the Eyes of World Teachers who tell their experiences and views from different countries.
Our curriculum consists of key learning areas which empower students to become confident communicators, critical and imaginative thinkers, problem solvers, decision makers, lifelong learners and informed, active participants and leaders in Australian society.
Činjenica da već djelujemo, odgajamo i educiramo mlade ljude u 21. stoljeću gdje je tehnologija dosegla veoma visok nivo, primarna je funkcionalna pismenost naših učenika na maternjem jeziku. Uz funkcionalnu pismenost tu je neizostavna i digitalna pismenost kojom smo silom prilika putem online nastave postala je zapravo neizostavan dio naše svakodnevnice. Komunikacija, usvajanje sadržaja na stranim jezicima, učenje kako učiti, odnosno meta učenje, kao i integracija STEM programa u naše nastavne planove i programe je ono u čemu trebamo težiti u budućnosti.
We are trying to provide to the students different kinds of information regarding the business activities. While we are living in the country where there are a lot of challenges in the world, we try to make them ready for their future and how they will be ready to challenge the world and the business itself. So while they are studying here the business entrepreneurship, they can gain information, knowledge and learn a lot about business plans. They will learn a lot about how to deal with different external things that can happen in their life.
Жана 9-11 класстын балдарына жыл сайын илимий изилдөө практикалык сабактарын өткөрүп турабыз. Бул жерде окуучулар таштандылар менен күрөшүү, смог жана башка экологиялык көйгөйлөрдүн жана таза суу программасынын алкагында иш алып барышат. Бул илимий изилдөө практикалык сабактардан балдар келечекте кесип тандоосу калыптанат.
Howard Gardner's research of multiple intelligences are important to note here, as the world can be understood mathematically, linguistically, musically, interpersonally and more. With this in mind, we differentiate our teaching programs for our students to ensure their individual needs are met and they have opportunities to display their many talents.
Svako dijete je posebna individua koja se razvija u skladu sa svojim individualnim mogućnostima, ovladava različitim stilovima učenja i načinima razumijevanja sadržaja. Zbog toga je važno uzeti u obzir subjektivne sposobnosti učenika na koje mi učitelji, odnosno prosvjetni radnici, ne možemo utjecati, ali ono na što možemo utjecati su objektivne mogućnosti naših učenika. Na koji način to možemo uraditi? To možemo uraditi primjenom različitih metoda, strategija, projektne, istraživačke nastave i kontinuiranom edukacijom nastavnog kadra.
It is possible to address the needs of different countries and at the same time make available learning environments that take into account individual and regional differences among students with the help of internationalized programs. International institutions which engage in educational activities in many countries serve communities with different languages, cultures, and ethnic backgrounds on multiple continents by implementing a range of programs. This session aims to examine multiculturalism, multilingualism, and differentiation methods that consider students' needs within the context of the internationalization of education programs. We will discuss the internationalization of curriculum with our respected and distinguished speakers. Now joining us for this panel is Lavinya Stennett, who is a writer, activist, and founder and CEO of the Black Curriculum. Lavinya was recently named as one of the Sunday Times 50 Women of the Year and was awarded Trailblazer of the Year by Hello Magazine, as well as being featured in Vogue for her activism. Her Excellency Ayşen Gürcan, who is the member of the Board of Trustees at the Turkish Maarif Foundation, she served as the Minister of Family and Social Policies during the 63rd election of Turkey, and she served as the Chief Advisor to the President. She has publications in educational sciences, teacher education, and family education. Fernando Reimers, who is the Ford Foundation Professor of the Practice of International Education. He's also the Director of the Global Education Innovation Initiative and of the International Education Policy Master's Program at Harvard University. He's an expert in the field of global education. His research focuses on understanding how to educate children and youth so they thrive in the 21st century. And last but not least, Pete Dudley, who is an education leader, researcher, and system reformer. He taught in UK schools and abroad, holding leadership posts locally, nationally, and internationally. He directed the UK government's primary national strategy during 2006 to 2011. Now he's an associate professor in education leadership at the University of Cambridge. Once again, thank you all for joining us. Now, I'd like to begin with Lavinya Stennett. Mrs. Lavinya, how do you think Black curriculum makes a difference in the British education system, and have you had the effect you were hoping for?
So the Black curriculum, we are a social enterprise that is dedicated to teaching Black histories all year round, because Black history is British history, and every young person needs an opportunity to understand the fullness of British history so that they can actively see themselves as part of the community and make a change. And so we offer an ability to learn our curriculum through teacher trainings, and also through direct workshops with the Black curriculum. Now, over the past 2 years, since we set up, we've been able to reach over 3,500 teachers directly to train them. And also for our young people, the response has been very good, because they've said that this is something they haven't learned before, and they actually want to learn more Black histories, because in school, they're not really offered the opportunity to do so unless they have teachers who are engaged with this. So I think for us, we've had a really good response to it since we've started. And I think what's needed is that every school adopts the Black curriculum. And I think until we reach that goal, the work won't stop. So yeah.
To Ayşen Gürcan, I'll ask my question in Turkish. Uluslararası bir program için öğrenen profilinin anlamı nedir? Maarif Vakfı öğrenen profili nasıl bir kurguyla oluşturulmuştur efendim?
And how would the Maarif Foundation constitute that? Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome all of the participants. As you know, our program, its learner profile is a part of an international curriculum. And when we say an international curriculum, it involves different geographies, cultures, in the context of a common standard. So we're trying to create an education program as such. In this regard, the learner profile is one of the major focuses of an international program, because the learner's profile is fundamental in terms of setting a common standard, and it involves the skill sets and the capabilities that we want our students to acquire. At the end of this profile, rather than the acquisitions that we aim, we focus on metacognitive capacity and its usage skills. In many programs, the learner's profile, this learner's profile is used around the world, and in the Maarif program of IM, all the actors within the system, from teachers to managers, from students to parents, we depart from the common skills that all of these actors accept. In other words, all the actors that are part of the education system, in any case, we expect them to act in line with their profiles, and the system would would function as it was designed. So all the factors should be defined so that they could be easily implemented, and all the indicators should be clearly declared. In the IM, the learner's profile involves basic features and responsibilities, and it involves the participation and identifications of every actor involved in the foundation. Since the first years of Maarif Foundation, this study has been moving fast because in different geographies, different cultures, in order to provide a common education, you have to respond to the question of what kind of a human individual we want. So the learner's profile in the Maarif Foundation, we thought what kind of variables it should be identified on. You know, the changes in epistemology involves the student skills rather than the gathering of information. So we should invest in human. You know, being a carrier of information is not really what matters. What matters is the ability to do things. That is the skill. In this regard, Maarif learner's profile has 4 variables. The first one is the capacity to use the mind, the learner mind. The second one is management of the will, making right decisions. The third one is in a social environment, the individual should reflect the propositions of her conscience. So conscience is what we want them to learn. And fourth is a management of time. It's not just about a cognitive or emotional capacity. We should build a capacity on management of time as well. So on the basis of the 4 skills, we added 4 feature to each one of them. Let me just expand on them a bit. In a smart learner, for example, a critical analytical thinking, a research-oriented individual who learned how to learn, it is important for us. For the willful learner, you know, principled, determined, and motivated individuals come to the fore, and they should basically bear a responsibility, of course. And the third dimension, you know, that focuses on conscious in a social environment, that person should be reliable in the word and act. That person should also be sensitive, empathetic, and merciful. So, and being transparent is also what we expect. In the fourth variable, risk-taking, brave individuals come to the fore, who have diplomatic skills, and in conflicts, they move in a balanced and harmonious manner. So they have an effective social interactive skill, and they are ready to share. That is what they have. In this regard, the learner's profile in the Maarif program that we identified, IM, in the development of its curriculum, we try to give an answer to what kind of an individual we aim at. That is, well, let this be my answer to the first question.
Gürcan. And now I'd like to continue with Fernando Reimers. Fernando, how can the global pandemic affect national and international education programs? And can we predict that the pandemic may cause a structural change in curriculum?
Thank you for the question. I think one of the main goals of a curriculum is not only to provide guidance to individual teachers, but to teams of teachers working in the same school, so that there is coherence in the experience that students have from one subject to another, from one grade to the next. And The most powerful educational experiences are those that are for students both authentic and relevant. Authentic to problems that they see in the world, relevant to things that they value. The pandemic has changed the social, the economic context of schools and is therefore an opportunity for teams of teachers within the school to ask themselves, what is it that we should help our students understand? What is it that we should help them be able to do? UNESCO has just published a report on the futures of education. UNESCO in its history has only 3 times put together an independent commission that has produced an invitation to reimagine education. And this report is distinctive from the previous 2 reports in several ways. The first one is that it is not addressed primarily to governments. The 2 previous reports were built on the notion that educational change happens when governments decide to make it happen. This report instead is built on the premise that the culture of education changes when teachers, when students, when parents, when the entire society has a conversation and comes to agreement about what it is that students should learn and be able to do and care about. So therefore, this report is an invitation to each and every one of you to engage in a process of co-constructing what the implications of these ideas are for your school. And so what I'd like to do today is to invite all of you listening in to go online, go into Google and type Futures of Education UNESCO, download the report, and begin a conversation with your colleagues. There is about what the future of education should be in your institution. There is another way in which this report is distinctive from the 2 previous ones. The 2 previous reports looked at the school at 30,000 feet, didn't really get into much detail on questions of pedagogy, curriculum, school organization, or teaching profession. This report does, with intention of being provocative. It does talk about the necessity to anchor curriculum very clearly and intentional on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This curriculum, this report says the main challenges that humanity is facing have to do with the deterioration, with climate change, with social fragmentation, with growing violence, with extreme inequality and growing poverty, and with democratic backsliding around the world. And it is fundamental that education is intentionally aligned with a conception that was put together at the end of World War II, at the end of this terrible episode of violence of humanity and of the Holocaust, and where essentially the world community concluded that the way we would never see the horrors of World War II again, but was by building a global order in which the rights of every person were respected. And that's what this document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is about. And so this report, on this UNESCO report on the futures of education, does talk about the necessity of changing curriculum, of opening the doors and the windows of the school to the outside world, of helping students understand how it is that what we're learning is connected to what happens outside the school, which, as I mentioned, has been radically altered as a result of the pandemic. And developing not only the capacity to know, not only knowledge, but the desire to make a difference and the skills to make a difference. Producing people who not only understand what human rights are, who not only care about human rights, but who have the skills in their work every day in the school and outside to advance a world in which human rights are a reality for each and every person in their schools, in their communities, in their nations, and in the world. And so I think that the global pandemic, which in many ways is the greatest calamity in the history of education, at least since public education was invented, is also an opportunity for us to be more aware of the fragility of human life on this planet, of our own vulnerability, and to become more intentional and use this phenomenal architecture of schools that has been built really over the last, for most kids, over the last 80 years, and use them to empower every student to be not only a person capable of having the agency, the voice, the capacity to become the architects of their own lives, but especially the capacity to come together with others for the shared purpose of improving the communities of which they are a part. And in that sense, sensitizing students to this global compact adopted at the General Assembly of the United Nations in 2015, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which outlines a world in which we all belong, a world which is sustainable, a world in which we resolve our differences not by resorting to violence, but through peaceful means. that framework can be used to reimagine curriculum, to reimagine how it is that we teach students, what we teach them, and how we empower them to become stewards of a world that is more inclusive and more sustainable.
For sure. Fernando, Reimers, thank you for your answer. Now I'd like to continue with Pete Dudley. Mr. Dudley, what features do you expect to stand out in the learning profiles of international curriculum, and how can these features form the basis for an international curriculum? Sorry, we can't seem to hear you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I'd muted myself. Thank you very, very much indeed for the question. Thank you for inviting me today. First of all, I'd like to thank the three previous speakers. I found much to agree with in what every single one of you said. I've been crossing out the things that I was going to say. But in relation to your question, I think we have to think about what a curriculum is, and a definition of a curriculum which has struck me from being quite a young teacher is that a curriculum is a series of emphases and omissions. And in schools, we ask ourselves what kind of people we want to be living in the country in 20, 30 years' time, and what values we want them to have and how we want them to behave. And therefore we emphasize some things and we omit others. I think one of the problems with consciously thinking about curriculum is that in education, a lot of the things we do in the classroom, we do unconsciously. We draw on knowledge because the classroom is so fast moving and so unpredictable, and you've got 30 or more children all thinking different things. As a teacher, you are making decisions very, very fast. So you tend to rely often on what's called tacit knowledge for the decisions you make. So you may devise or work with a wonderful curriculum, but nevertheless impart messages which can be quite counter to what consciously you want to do. So we also have to think about what an international hidden curriculum might be like. And I think it's great that we've got Lavinya here, who's done much to develop a curriculum which counters many of the subliminal messages that have been inevitably transmitted in the national curriculum in England, let's say, which we've had for 33 years. And it's very, very clear that every child should learn. Children should learn to respect each other and be equal. And yet when you look at the outcomes of education in this country, you see that they're very unequal. And you see that minoritized people who are victims of racism, the Black population, are far more likely to not have the outcomes that the white population has leaving school, and they're far more likely still to not have great lives and to die younger. So it's imperative that in an international curriculum, we're very clear that people have those skills that that Professor Ayşen was discussing, of being able to really critically evaluate what they're doing. And those are skills that have to be passed on to children. And also to be able to critically evaluate the unseen, hidden powers and dynamics that oppress certain people and don't oppress others. I think internationally, there are great examples of curricula where particularly students will work across countries. There's some good ones through the Erasmus program in the EU, where students work online, they solve problems, they address big global issues like climate change and health and aging. But in the end, it has to be put into the hands of highly sensitized and highly trained local practitioners to make sense locally. I've worked with people in under military occupation, trying to implement programs from not UNESCO, but I think the World Bank. And what makes sense in the World Bank doesn't make sense doesn't translate immediately into those contexts. So the idea of localizing and then tracking back and making sure that you're meeting the spirit and the outcomes of the original idea is important. And one curriculum idea which I will outline for that, which strangely we're just discovering after many, many years in the UK, is teaching spoken language right up to the age of 16, 17, 18. We tend to think that once a child can speak, and let's face it, it's the most complex learning task any of us ever achieves. Most of us do, that we'll just pick it up, but it's not the case. Many children get gaps in their language, and gaps in language means gaps in one's thinking. We need language to think, to reason, to be critical. So thought and language, as Vygotsky taught us, are integral to learning. And if you can teach children not just to learn to talk effectively, but also to learn together through talk, through collaborative learning and through exploratory talk, and we call this oracy, and optimize that talk so that the learning outcomes are more or less guaranteed. Children can learn things and solve problems that the brightest of them couldn't have done alone. And we know that that knowledge will stay within them because they have constructed it together. You can even neuroscientifically image the development of the brain to see this happen. So I would put into any international curriculum a strong element of oracy and collaborative learning.
Very much, Pete Dudley. Now I'd like to once again ask my second question to Lavinya Stennett. Mrs. Stennett, how do you assess the situation of disadvantaged groups when you observe the education system of many countries? And what do you suggest about ensuring fairness in education?
Thank you for your question. So assessing disadvantaged groups and the issues that they're having around being included in education, I think it's really important to understand on the ground, what are those young people saying? Because often in education, we have a framework that doesn't actually capture what is happening on the ground. And take, for example, Black young boys in the UK who are 5 times more likely to be excluded than their white counterparts. It's very easy for us to look from an educational point of view to say that they're disengaged, or maybe that they are causing trouble within the classroom. But outside of that, there are many different factors that are correlating to produce this outcome. So I think the first thing is understanding from outside of the educational system, what are those young people saying and what are they doing? Their interests might, for example, lie outside of maths, or it might, for example, be within more community settings where they're able to express themselves. So I think in terms of actually designing a curriculum or designing initiatives where they can actively be engaged, it's really important to know where those young people are at, firstly, and then meeting them there. I think secondly, when we're also looking at disadvantaged groups, the most important thing to understand is, again, those outcomes. And as a care leaver, I can also say that I think 4% of care leavers end up going to university. Why is that the case? So I think from a research point of view, it's really important to look at the statistics, understand the different journeys that those young people are taking, so that we can actually look at examples that, again, fall outside of just education or the classroom, where we will see that students are just disengaged, but actually looking at the outcomes as well, and then drawing parallels between that. Because what we see is happening, for example, in the north of England might not be the same thing that happens in London, because London in and of itself is its own, it can be looked at in its own city. So what I would say is that it's really important to look at the outcomes, understand what young people are saying, and also draw those parallels between different communities so that we can get a fuller picture, and then make decisions based on that. And then I'd also say, in terms of prioritizing fairness in education, I think understanding, again, the undercurrents of the issue is key. It's enough to say that, you know, we need a diversity in education, or we need inclusion, but what is promoting that inclusion, or what is fueling that, rather, from from a systemic point of view. And I think bringing together conversations, bringing together people to talk about the realities of their experience will actually help to amplify the reality. So what I'm really just trying to say is that we can't look at issues in isolation, and they have to essentially include the communities that we're serving, essentially, in curriculum design.
Absolutely, very true. Thank you, Lavinya Stennett. Now I'd like to continue with Professor Ayşen Gürcan. Maarif Vakfı dünyanın birçok coğrafyasında faaliyetler yürütmektedir. Bu faaliyetlerde öğrenen profilinin farklı kültürlere uygulanmasında ne tip güçlükler yaşamaktasınız efendim?
What kind of difficulties do you have in the implementation of the curriculum that you promote, that you have? The speaker's mic is muted, so I cannot translate that
Efendim
part.
sesiniz gelmiyor. Gerçi.
Çok özür dilerim. Yani
I'm sorry.
Mikrofonum kapalı kalmış.
My mic was
Panelin güzel gittiğini
closed.
düşünüyorum. Bir yandan Lavinya'nın
I believe we are having a beautiful panel. The inequality of opportunity and the discrimination that Lavinya mentioned, and establishing common standards and common principles, as was mentioned by Mr. Peter, are the issues that we should focus on at the global scale. Because with the effect of globalization, can we create common values within and among the students? So the question that you ask, maybe our participants would know, but you know, Maarif Foundation is active in 5 continents and 46 countries in different cultures, different geographies, different language. And especially in such different worlds, the educational activities of the same institution should have a standard of its own. In this regard, after creating the IM program, we have to establish an approach to create a roadmap. And in this regard, we identified 3 focal areas that involve different cultures and countries. So these are musts in an international program. The first one is that it should be human-oriented. It should center around human. It should trust on teachers and students, and it should believe that it should equip them fully in this regard, and it should have an integrated approach with the values of the society. The second point is that it should be development oriented. All the shareholders, you know, it should focus on the development of its shareholders, from parents to students and teachers. In this regard, so we should improve on a daily basis, and we should monitor and evaluate on a continuous basis. A third point, perhaps, is that it should turn the cultural differences into richness, because once you develop a standard program, students would have their own local values, and we have to involve the positive side of this programs, these values, and we should enable them to learn their mother tongue very well. And Turkey has an experience on these 3 focal points, and this experience allows us to estimate the issues before this show up. So, as Mr. Peter mentioned, it's not really the knowledge, but human features are what that matter, and we cared about that. We departed from common human heritage. For example, being a conscious individual. Well, it has been elevated in all the cultures. So in the problems that may arise in different geographies, you know, the variation of the values is the case, and the different geographies would have different priorities. So we should not expect consecutive variables, but we should create a flexibility in a modular system that is independent from each other. So standards of the virtuous individual, we believe it should be implemented in every school. And we took measures to that end. For example, we had a meeting in Mali, for example, recently. The feedback that we obtained from the students and the feedback we get from parents' meetings and the managers and teachers, we try to create a common ground. So in terms of creation of standards, we want consecutive things, but we don't expect them to take place in every country simultaneously, because these countries are different from each other. So every school would exhibit differences in terms of physical features and other aspects. So the implementation criteria is a must to be identified now. So what do we expect from this education? And in terms of exercising the human values, we ask the question, how would math, history, or science involve in this question? You know, I'm going to talk about that in more detail in the third round, but I think if we provide a good answer to this question, we would be eliminating some problems before they show up. So in areas that we cannot create common curriculum, we would have difficulties. And as much as possible, we are trying to create an international curriculum, and especially in the graduation of our students, we want to have an accredited system. It's going to help us overcome these issues. Regarding other necessities and difficulties, challenges, you know, sometimes we fail to recognize the problems, and this could be a handicap. So in this regard, with whatever method you follow, sometimes you may not get the result in the field, and sometimes you feel resistance in the field. So what kind of precautions you take to utilize the cultures, for example, we should be able to estimate them. So regarding the solution strategies, this would provide a wealth of experience for us. You know, something that we implement successfully in a geography would offer a good example to another geography. So the learner profile of the IM program would move on in a healthy manner.
Thank you very much, Professor Ayşen Gürcan. Now I'd like to continue, please, with Fernando Reimers. Mr. Reimers, how should international curriculum be structured to protect local languages and cultures in a world where culture and language evolves towards uniformization?
It's a great question. I think that one of the goals of any international or global curriculum should be to help students understand the deep interdependence between the global and the local, and to help them replace the mindset that it is either or, and replace it instead with a mindset that is and. Let me give you an example. If you were to teach students not only what the Sustainable Development Goals are, but the capacities to make a difference. Goal number one is no poverty. Helping a student understand, care about, and make a difference about poverty is not helping them to understand poverty as what happens out there somewhere else. It's to help them look within their own community, within their own backyard, within their own society, and gradually take the student from what is immediate and familiar to what is more distant and removed, and to help them understand those connections, to help them understand that poverty is local as well as global, and that oftentimes global processes are implicated in some of these local issues. And the pandemic is a wonderful object lesson in that respect. The pandemic is deeply local, but deeply global. And we will not solve this pandemic until it is solved everywhere in the world. The way to help students begin to understand that is not by teaching them about how the pandemic is unfolding in places that are remote and unfamiliar, but to help them understand how it is unfolding in their own communities, in their own societies, and gradually take them to see that. The same, of course, is true with teaching them about culture, with teaching them about heritage, with teaching them about language, with teaching them about what I consider a fundamental building block of a global curriculum, and that is religious literacy. And by religious literacy, I do not mean the inculcation of students, the induction into a particular religious faith, which is the subject of religious education, but I mean helping them understand that in this day and age, a lot of people make sense of the world through a values framework that is shaped by their religious beliefs, and that it is indispensable in order to have the capacity to communicate with others, to put oneself in our shoes, to have enough literacy of those beliefs so that we can communicate, so that we can understand. So I don't think there is an either or. I don't think that, for example, if you were trying to teach students in a particular community, even in a school that adheres to religious faith, I don't think you have to choose between teaching them that faith, the basic tenets of that faith, and teaching them the religious literacy they will understand, to know that religion is a social construction and that their faith is not the only faith, that there are many different faiths, that there are issues that are common across different faiths, that the way in which a particular religious faith influences how people function in a society can vary across time, across societies, and so on. So I do think, however, that this pandemic has heightened the interest in a global curriculum around the world. And the reason I say that is because at the beginning of the pandemic, I published this book, which synthesizes my own work over a decade with global citizenship education. And I had my doubts that anyone in the middle of this crisis was going to pay any attention. And to date, 164,000 people have downloaded this book. By the way, it's an open access book. And so maybe there is something about this moment that is helping us understand more than in other times that we're all connected to one another, that the local and the global are not two different universes. They are two sides of the same coin. We all need to develop capacities and identities that are deeply rooted in our local communities, in our traditions, but that can also help us understand that we're members of a much bigger tribe than the tribe that is familiar, that we're members of a human species that is either going to survive together or perish together in this planet. And I do think that a global curriculum, especially if it draws on a language that makes it possible for educators across different schools, across different societies, can be an avenue to do that. Formalized curriculum is simply a way to make it possible for teachers to test the two basic hypotheses on which any teaching is based. The hypothesis that if I engage my students in activity A, they will learn B. And the second hypothesis that if they learn B, the consequences for themselves, for their communities, will be C, D, and E. It is only the most reflective educators who take the time to evaluate those hypotheses. But most of them do that in the privacy of their own head. They don't share this knowledge with their colleagues. They don't engage in this process with these colleagues. And I think that in order to professionalize the practice of international education, we need to make it possible to make the evaluation of those hypotheses public and visible. I have seen the power of doing that. In this curriculum, which I developed with my colleagues, we do something very simple. We take the UN Sustainable Goals and we take the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and from them we develop a profile of a graduate of high school with 180 competencies. And then from there, we develop a trajectory, a sequence that goes from kindergarten to high school, engages students in project-based pedagogies to take them from being novices to experts. what I have found, this curriculum is now being taught in thousands of schools around the world and in many different countries. And I have followed some of those uses of the curriculum. And what I think is most powerful is not the curriculum per se, is the process through which teachers are able to communicate across countries because they have these tools, because they have these protocols, because they have this language that allows them to say, these were my experiments in developing the capacities of students to learn about, to care, and to be able to do something about poverty. This is what I achieved. What were your experiments, and what did you achieve? So I think in many ways we need to professionalize the practice of experimentation and innovation in curriculum so that it becomes more similar to the way in which we are tackling this pandemic, which is you have scientists who are doing research, which they publish rather quickly, and which becomes part of a global commons so that we can all together learn from one another and collectively achieve things we could not achieve individually. I think that in education, too often, we expect teachers alone to carry the burden of the world in their shoulders. And I think this pandemic is making increasingly evident that that's not a realistic expectation, that teachers in communities, as part of professional communities, in networks that connect many schools, that connect these schools with other institutions, such as universities, so that they can increase their capacity. It is only at that level and at that scale that we are able to produce the innovation and produce the designs that we need to prepare our students with the competencies, the deep competencies that we need to address the challenges of our times.
Thank you, Fernando, Reimers. Now I'd like to continue with Pete Dudley. Sir, can 21st century skills and competencies be structured efficiently with the curriculum that exists in many countries? And what kind of roadmap can be determined in this regard for a more qualified configuration?
Thank you. Well, I was just thinking as Professor Reimers was speaking, how some of the most profound learning experiences I ever had in terms of international curriculum and perspectives in learning was when I found myself living and working in a culture and in a context where the values and the norms were very different from those which I'd grown up experiencing, and where my normal responses to how to behave didn't make sense and weren't working. And it's then one has to completely relearn, and it's by that being forced to see things through other people's eyes, through other people's languages, and think their thoughts. And that's very, very hard to do through an international curriculum, where you might have the words of the organizations, UNESCO or the World Bank or others on paper. But as I said before, when you come to make that work in the classroom with colleagues and with the students that you're working with, it can look very different. So but I do think the opportunity that's happened, the big opportunity that's happened, ironically, through the pandemic, has been what we're doing now. Suddenly, the world is a much, much smaller place. We've got a really amazing group of people here today through Zoom and through other platforms. And we just do it now. We do it umpteen times, several times a day. We will go into Zoom and we will be in different parts of the world with totally different people. And it's normal. And I think that this is a huge opportunity. So I want to talk about an approach to I think all of you have really talked about how teachers can develop the skills, the knowledge, the understanding themselves through teaching an international curriculum to be able to teach it effectively. And I want to bring, to an extent, I want to bring the learners themselves, the students themselves, into this as well. I've worked for 20 years and I'm currently president of an organization which is called the World Association of Lesson Studies, and it promotes a form of teacher learning, teacher curriculum development, collaborative curriculum development through classroom research that was evolved in Japan 150 years ago and for the last 20 years has been moving worldwide. And there are 80 countries now that are involved in developing teachers' approaches to teaching through studying the learning of the children they're teaching and finding out whether what they're teaching is anything like what the children are learning. And sometimes, and I've been teaching, I'm ashamed to say, for many years before I realized how much what I was teaching was being heard completely differently by students, and how I had made assumptions about the students, going back to Lavinya's earlier point, which were very wrong. I thought that this student was probably quite weak and this student was quite strong. When you undergo a lesson study and over a sequence of lessons with your colleagues, you plan a piece of curriculum that you think will work, and then you discover that for 2 of, say, 3 focused pupils, it didn't work at all, and you thought it would, and then you begin to wonder how your normal teaching is. And if you talk to the students at the end of that process, and this is what happens through lesson study, and you say to them, well, you know what we were trying to do, and what we'd like to know is, if we're teaching this lesson with a class like this tomorrow, how could we improve it for those children or for those students? They themselves are experts in teaching. They are in schools day in, day out, and many of them have been for years. They will come up with extremely insightful and very often simple and obvious things that you can do to improve that lesson and to involve and include more students in the learning, that you just can't see because you're an adult. And the other thing I think that's so powerful about collaborative inquiry, collaborative inquiry developed curricula, is that by studying individual children, you can see, as you can never see normally, how certain aspects of the curriculum may be excluding them, may be actively oppressing them. And you can see how it's affecting their learning. And normally, as I've said, the classroom's so busy, teachers can't do that. And because they're working together in this process, talking about the planning and what they expect the children to be able to do, and then analyzing what the children did and what they think they learned afterwards, in great detail and with huge energy and care, because teachers want the children to learn. You know, we get out of bed every day because we want children to learn better. But through doing that, it's also possible to surface some of the assumptions that one has about how and why children are learning, and what this approach that these materials that we're going to use is going to, how it's going to work, and have what actually happens challenge your assumptions and make you realize that you've got it wrong. Now, that for me, I've seen it again and again and again. It's very simple. It doesn't take any technology. It just takes some teachers and some students and a commitment to carry out the best inquiry that you can. But I've seen it develop curricula which meet the needs of complex sets of children in central London, in Camden, trying to implement a knowledge-based mathematics curriculum. And I've seen it lead to the discovery that actually it wasn't actually the maths that was the problem half the time. It was the children's mental language and inability to, there were gaps in their mental language that they needed to have built up before they could conceive of the issue. Perhaps because they were bilingual and learning English as a second language, perhaps because they just hadn't encountered those forms of language in a way where they could interact with them and want to learn them before, because they had put them off. So it's a complex affair, but I would strongly urge that an international curriculum is now possible. We've seen, I think Andreas Schleicher, another speaker in this series of webinars, was involved in a webinar, an OECD webinar last month in Kazakhstan, where they have used lesson study now in all their state schools, and where they shut down every school for a whole year during the pandemic, and were still able to conduct lesson studies, and were still able to diagnose and improve their curricula and help find the children who were falling behind before their learning started to suffer, and it showed in their work. So I would advocate collaborative inquiry, systematic inquiry, And going back to Professor Reimers' point, shared, made public. Teachers love to find out what other teachers are doing. And this is a systematic way of doing it. If it's worked in Japan for 150 years, it can work elsewhere.
Very interesting points there. Thank you, Pete Dudley. I'd like to continue with Lavinya Stennett. Ms. Stennett, what assumptions should be considered when creating an international teaching program, and what kind of structural fiction would you suggest for the creation of an international program?
Thank you. I don't want to repeat what everyone else has said, but I think there's been some really valid points around sharing networks, as well as the internationalization of the curriculum, particularly amongst sharing learnings and also, more importantly, approaches. And I think one of the key assumptions is knowing that the world is interconnected. So, for example, the Black curriculum actually started in New Zealand. When I was studying there, it was really apparent to me that they had an approach and a model, particularly in primary schools, that was focused on including Maori history, as well as speaking about issues surrounding colonialism. And that approach isn't something that is taken much, especially in primary schools in the UK. In fact, our approach here is not to speak on race because it's too much of a sensitive topic, or the British Empire, for example, isn't a topic that we really delve into probably until latter education, for example, universities. So I think it's really important that we understand how the world is interconnected, not only through these systems such as empire, we think about climate change, how all these things really interact. I think it's really important that our approach starts there, knowing, for example, that countries in the Caribbean are connected to issues that are happening in Africa, as well as Europe and the rest of the world. So it's thinking from a perspective of building a program where we connect all these threads and feed it into a framework where we're really thinking about the universality of education. I think, secondly, the legacy of these systems needs to be approached within our education as well. And in terms of creating a teaching program, it's really important that we don't divorce maybe our theories, as well as topics that we're teaching, from the realities that many people are experiencing and have experienced. So I think the two can't be seen as separate. Education is a microcosm of society. And I think it's really key that we have an approach that really thinks about bringing in life experiences, but also anecdotal experiences that aren't always theoretical. So I'd say the systems can't be divorced from what we're doing. And that leads into my third point of having an education where teachers are not only the teachers, we have parents, we have community actors who are also very key in terms of young people's learning, and a teaching program that is centered on the community and brings in a range of actors is very key, not only to share the burden, as we've seen during the pandemic, but also, more importantly, to bring in a range of perspectives that can actually help to draw out and also extend the learning, because learning doesn't just happen in schools. And this is my last point, but I think it's a very crucial point, and I don't want anyone to miss this, because social media right now is the biggest teacher. Young people come from education or classrooms and go straight onto their phones and are learning, right? And I think in terms of building a teaching program, we have to be able to understand how to use social media to not only influence, but also understand what young people are actually learning. So those pages that they're following, what are they doing to engage those young students, and how can that really connect to what parents can do at home? And I think we can't, just center this around what happens within the four walls of the classroom, but it has to extend to online, because again, we're all very interconnected. And if one thing that has come out of the pandemic that is a benefit is that we've all understood what's happening globally. So I think it's key that we engage with social media in terms of building a program and making sure that it's relevant to those young people.
Very true. Now I'd like to continue with Professor Ayşen Gürcan. Farklı dil ve kültürlere sahip öğretmenlerin aynı öğrenen profilinde buluşan ortak eğitim anlayışları nasıl oluşturulabilir?
language can use a same curriculum? Can they use? Of course, the biggest handicap for an international curriculum is it has to be made on top of the common values. But the biggest problem about that, a program that has been created in a center, we expect that program to be applied to different geographies, different cultures, different languages, and it may not be possible. And of course, the actors, the teachers, the leaders that is going to be using this program has to have feedback and has to have a voice in the decision-making process while we are creating a common culture and common curriculum. We have to have a monitoring studies and we have to evaluate this program. Especially this common program shouldn't just have a common content. It's beyond content. This curriculum should include methods and it should affect the medium of school, and teacher shouldn't be just an instruction. Teacher should help students create their creativity and ideas. As Lavinya also said, social media has become a teacher, so you cannot be limited with the school. There are a lot of different sources of information in addition to the school, so you have to create common values, and you can only do this together if you work together. And in addition to that, I think the best practice to develop these common values, we have to have development programs for teachers. We have to have training centers. We have to have academies, for example, not just for content and information, about skills, about problem-solving skills, and being solution-based, and creating common solution models for teachers. And as I've said also, for evaluation, we should create new techniques and we should work on them. And if there are specific methods that do not work, we have to have local solutions for different problems. So we are an association that is 5 years old, and we have been through a lot in these 5 years, but for our work on our common standards, I must say that we have experienced a lot of different problems, and especially every country has different curriculum, and also the meaning that they put onto the student and the people's expectations on the students are different. And these small differences, even if they are small, it has big impact on common standards. So in that sense, we have to take smaller steps, and also we have to focus on the basics, and we have to first decide on the basics and maybe improve it locally in specific parts so that the program can work multiculturally. Especially, I think the feedback from different countries should be valued and should be considered definitely. And I think this is going to be the key to success of such program. And for solutions, especially for the economic systems, these professionals have created the solutions and solution-based problems. So we have to apply this same thing. We have to decide on specific things that we have to focus on. For example, being open to communication, being open to collaboration, critical thinking, and different things that we want to focus on. And we have to base on our, we have to have our common values, and we have to base them on this one, I believe.
Thank you so much, Professor Ayşen Gürcan. Now I'd like to continue with Fernando Reimers, please. Sir, what skills and competencies should be at the forefront of educational programs for a better world?
It's a big question, but I would say two mindsets are very important. One is helping students understand that most issues that we deal with are not binary issues. To think beyond black and white, to recognize a world in which we can live with complexity. I think one of the biggest challenges of our times is that through the spread of technologies, which can be used for all kinds of purposes, it is possible to reach out to individuals who feel excluded, who feel they don't belong in the communities of which they are a part, and to basically inculcate them in a sense of simple truths, disinformation, and then to manipulate them, in effect, to brainwash them. So again, to go back to this pandemic, in the United States, only over half of the population has agreed to be vaccinated. And sadly, to some extent, that has happened because some of these efforts of brainwashing manipulation have been used to suggest to people that following the simple guidance of public health authorities is an expression, whether to follow or not, is an expression of political beliefs. It's very sad because the consequence when that happens is that many more people die than would need to die. If we did something like recognize the power of this enterprise we call science to help guide us in the context of a pandemic. And some of the dangers, I think, of our time come, for example, from extremely intolerant groups of one persuasion on another. In the US, the main security challenge to this nation comes from white supremacist groups, groups that are persuaded that the white race has superior rights to other races and who organize through these platforms, again, to reach out to disaffected individuals, to individuals who feel marginalized, excluded, and to give them a sense of belonging in a cult of some sort. The reason it's important in the context of a pandemic to be very mindful of those risks is because another big pandemic, the pandemic of 1918, contributed to the rise of Hitler to power. And the mechanism through which he did that is the pandemic induced an economic recession in Germany, which translated into the decline in municipal spending, which marginalized a lot of people, made them feel out of luck, made them feel that nobody cared about them. And in that context, an individual who was considered a pariah, a clown by the political establishment in 1918, over 15 years, was able to build a coalition of all those disaffected individuals and to become elected Chancellor of Germany. His name was Adolf Hitler. And so I think one of the things that any education should do nowadays is to, first of all, convey to every student that they belong and to actually not only make them feel, but make it a reality that they are included, but also help them understand that the world is not black and white. Help them understand that many issues are complex, that the world doesn't function with simple stories, and help them process that, I think, is very useful. The second mindset that I think is important to educate students in, but also teachers and others, is help them think about the kinds of forms of collaboration among humans, the kinds of organizations that are going to help us solve these complex challenges. A very common mindset is what I would call a bureaucratic mindset. Bureaucracies were a great invention of the 19th century. They were built on the premise that you could specialize the functions of individuals, of large groups of individuals, and in this way accomplish great things, organize great armies, organize great states, organize government. But I think in 3 centuries, we have learned that good ideas can come from anywhere, that a person who sits in a formal position of authority doesn't, by virtue of that, have the monopoly of the values of the ideas that everyone should pursue, that those ideas could come from any individuals. And an alternative, I think a more evolved conception of human organization is what I would call a pluralistic organization, as opposed to a bureaucratic organization. And if you think about the movements that have advanced human rights, whether it's the women's rights movement, the civil rights movement in the United States, the environmental movement, they often are the result of recognizing that individuals can challenge existing bureaucracies and say, it is not right that in this society, the United States, members of the white race should have superior rights to other groups, blacks and other people of color. It is not right that men should have superior rights than women. It is not right that we should relate to the environment in a predatory way that is making it impossible for the next generations to live. And so this notion that good ideas can come from anywhere takes skills and takes practice. One of the things I have been doing during the pandemic since March of 2020 is to study innovations that have happened everywhere as a way to help us continue to teach during this very difficult time. And I have found that many of these innovations come when leadership of education organizations recognizes that good ideas can come from anywhere. Let me just give you two examples. When the government of Chile decided that they were going to close down the schools as a way to control the spread of the virus, a group of teachers in a very low-income neighborhood in Santiago de Chile, in the outskirts of Santiago, asked themselves, what's going to happen to our students? They didn't ask, what is the government going to do about our students? They said, what's going to happen to our students? And these groups of students, of teachers, are members of a network that operates in 70 different countries. And one of the things that that network does is to produce a newsletter documenting what things are happening. And the Friday prior to the Monday when the government shut down the schools, these two young people had learned that their peers in Uganda had used their iPhones to record lessons, very simple lessons in mathematics and English, and had used WhatsApp to distribute them. And so that inspired these two young Chilean teachers, and they did the same thing. And their lessons were so engaging, were so funny, were so humorous, that within a week, everyone in this low-income community, not just the students, the parents, and even people who didn't have children in the schools, were listening to those lessons. So the mayor of this municipality was curious. He listened to the lessons. And at a meeting of 200 mayors from very low-income communities, he shared the idea. And these mayors were curious, and he said, well, can we spread the lessons in our communities too? So they built partnerships with local radio stations. And within 3 weeks, the lesson that these two young teachers had generated to teach their students were now being served in 200 different communities. Now, none of that would have happened if these two individuals had not been inspired by what their peers in Uganda had done. And if the leaders of that place, the mayor, had not had the humility to understand that good ideas can come from anywhere, and that what a good leader of a pluralistic enterprise can do sometimes is to empower, to amplify, to spread those good ideas, to support those that are generating them. Similarly, in the city of Bogota, when the national government decided to close down the schools, what the Secretary of Education did was to host a meeting via Zoom with all the school principals in the city, at which she said, I don't know how we're going to continue to teach if we cannot meet in schools. I don't have the solution, but I believe that together we can find a solution. And what I am committed to is making sure that during this very difficult period, we don't give up on our students. To me, that is exemplary leadership. That is built on the premise that she didn't have to have the monopoly of the truth or of the solutions, that she had the confidence as a leader to be able to be in front of her colleagues, of her hierarchical subordinates, and to ask for help and to say, let's do this together. So there are obviously more skills that I could say are important, but in my view, two very important skills to help us deal with the very difficult and complicated world that this pandemic has generated are teaching people to think with complexity help them appreciate that the world is not solved, and in particular, to inoculate them against the possibility of manipulation, of brainwashing from the demagogues of all political persuasions that are going to try to bring them, to utilize them, to bring them into a world in which individual freedoms are reduced. And on the other hand, help everybody understand that one of the things that technology gives us is the possibility to organize across bureaucratic boundaries, that we can break down the silos of our organizations, and that it is a smart organization, the organization that relies on the talent of everybody, including on the talent of those who disagree with those in positions of formal authority. Lastly, I think it is very important to balance the development of the capacities of individuals to take care of themselves and of their lives, to develop a notion of the common good, of the shared good, educating for the global common good, educating students to collaborate for the global common good, I think is one of the imperatives of our time. And it is also, I think, the subtitle of this new report of UNESCO titled Reimagining the Futures, Our Futures Together, a New Social Contract for Education.
Yes, very important and interesting points there. Thank you, Fernando, Reimers. Now, I'd like to continue with Pete Dudley with my final question. Can 21st century skills and competencies be structured efficiently with the curricula that exists in many countries? And what kind of roadmap can be determined in this regard for a more qualified configuration?
Thank you. I'd like to answer that, but at the same time also reflect on some of the contributions that we've had that I think have been extremely powerful and extremely telling, and that we should not forget. Yes, good ideas can come from anywhere, but so can bad ideas. And I think I've just been turning over in my mind the idea that perhaps one of the structures that we need for an international curriculum, given as Lavinya has said, social media is the school, as much as the school is the school, is that we need an international curriculum for the people who run social media platforms around the world, to prevent the echo chambers which they seem to create, in which people listen to people with similar ideas, or people end up finding themselves, and very often young people end up finding themselves bullied through social media and cannot break out of that, and are leading double lives where they'll physically, in their physical world, seem fine, be going to school, everything's okay, but actually what's going on inside their heads and on their phones is incredibly damaging, and has led to a massive increase in suicides. And I think that this is true for not just for social media systems, I think for all organizations. So I do think nations themselves have to step back and think about themselves also as a school. School leaders and school students collaborate. They collaborate in order to, in the best way possible, make their voices heard, but make their voices heard in a way that enables everyone to learn. And sometimes there are problems, but in the end, usually, everyone wants to solve those problems. Whether it's a child who's being disruptive in a class, there are usually good reasons for that, and that child doesn't want to be disruptive. And if we can find the reasons and find the barriers, we can solve that. But it's a collaborative endeavor, which I think is what we've all been saying, all four of us. But I don't think we can just rely on schools and an international curriculum for children to do that. I think we need an international curriculum, and not just for educators, but for all of us, for wider society. Lavinya was talking about the need to extend learning beyond the school and recognize the fact that we are all learning all the time through our lives, lifelong learning. And wherever we are in society, whether we are, whether we're working in in an ordinary job or whether we have a position of incredible responsibility, we should be thinking of those for whom we're responsible as our school, and that our role is to help them learn as best we can so that it will benefit not just them, but by benefiting them, it will benefit us and the rest of the world. Consequential validity, if you like, of learning. That's an enormous challenge, but I do think one place that it has to start, and urgently, is through the world's largest social media platforms, re-engineering the way that they configure the algorithms so that they don't do the kinds of things that Fernando has been saying, and that they do quite the opposite. They put people with interesting but not necessarily pernicious ideas together, and they can, through dialogue, explore and build new understandings and build new collaborations and build a better society. This was the vision of Paulo Freire, whose 100th birthday was last month, who is the most quoted educationist in the world. And if you've not read his work around solving problems through deliberate dialogue with the forces of oppression, then do so, because they, I think, hold out a ray of hope for achieving many of the goals that we've been discussing this afternoon.
Thank you, Lavinya, Stennett, Ayşen, Gürcan, Fernando, Reimers, and Pete Dudley. In this panel, we discussed about multiculturalism, multilingualism, and methods that consider students' needs within the context of internationalization of education programs. Thank you once again, and stay tuned for our next panel, which will start in 20 minutes. But first, a short video.